Good evening. Welcome to Pipes and Poetry. Welcome back to my garage where we smoke pipes and talk about poetry. Tonight I'm smoking again the Mac Baron vanilla. Again, starting to be able to taste a little bit of the notes of flavor, but for the most part, pipe tobacco smells really good when it's in the can. Smells awesome. Tastes like tobacco though. It's a good taste though. It's like it's different than cigarettes. I smoked cigarettes for a long time, but I quit that a long time ago. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about Marianne Moore. Marianne Moore, or we're going to talk about a poem by Marianne Moore. Marianne Moore was born in 1887, died in 1972. Another quite long-lived poet. Very influential. T.S. Eliot had some great quote about her. I should have written it down. Something about her. He was impressed by her, the way she contributed to the use of the English language. Very influential amongst poets to come. Being female, she's one of the earlier female poets. There are obviously female poets before her, but there weren't a lot doing it at the time when she was doing it. So, she's born in Missouri. Strangely enough, a lot of poets born in Missouri. T.S. Eliot was born in Missouri. He's the only great British poet to be born in Missouri. I heard that joke somewhere else. I'm not going to take credit for it, but. And if you don't get it, he did change over and move to Britain and became a British citizen and sort of embraced the British lifestyle, became probably as British as or more than some of the actual British poets. Anyway, Langston Hughes, also born in Missouri. I think he later was raised in Kansas, but born in Missouri. Obviously, most famous, at least to me, that I know of, not poet, but in English literature, Mark Twain, born in Missouri, and pretty much wrote about a lot about Missouri and being on the Mississippi River there. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, for the most part, take place in parts of Missouri. This poem is, let's see, is there anything else? Yeah. Takes place, let's go ahead and look at it. The poem is called Poetry. So what this is, and it's kind of why I wanted to do it now, kind of early on. There will be a few that we do that are sort of what is poetry? What is it? What does it do for us? What's its purpose? Is it superfluous? Okay, sorry about that. I didn't realize my microphone was away from me, but I'll try to adjust the volume and mix the two together. So this poem is it's called Poetry. Again, like I said, just probably repeat myself, but it's a sort of a defense of poetry, and we will read a couple of others. A few that come to mind. Wallace Stevens has a poem we'll probably like to discuss about poetry. I forget what it's called. And Shelley, Percy Shelley, wrote in defense of poesy or poetry. So we'll take a look and see how throughout the years, and there's been others, but maybe how different poets have defended poetry. And why is it necessary to defend? That's a good question. That sort of asks if someone's writing in defense of it, why does it need defending? is it something merely to occupy your leisure time, to for the well-to-do, well-educated? Is it whimsical, or can it be more than that? We'll see. I think looking at it from today, it definitely doesn't seem to have much of a place in modern culture today. Although it could in various different forms. Most songs, although they rely on the music, but songs are sort of like poetry. Rap songs definitely, carry a meter, a rhyme scheme. And we'll probably actually do some rap songs. There's a few I would like to talk about. And my son is a big rap fan, so he can help me pick some out too. I have some that are my favorites, but we can talk about those. But nevertheless, Marianne Moore writes this poetry. Let me make sure my iPad is working again. And let's take a look at what she has to say. I'll read through each stanza. I won't read through the whole thing. Like I said, I think we'll do this for the longer poems. She says, I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for us all, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. Okay, so I forgot how quickly I forgot, since I just read this like about an hour before making this. Well, you can't just read a stanza by Marianne Moore because she doesn't stop at the end of the stanza. A lot of poets are satisfied to just not stop at the end of the line and call it enjambment. But she just decides to keep on going before the stanza's over. Some of Marianne Moore is one of the things she's sort of known for is some of her poetry looks a lot like prose. And it may lead you to ask what makes it poetry. Is there a rhyme scheme? I mean, you can look at the end of the lines, fiddle, in, genuine, eyes, rise. There's a rhyme. Because a, are, the, not really an ending rhyme scheme. She does use alliteration, and maybe I think it may have been another poem of hers where it had a lot more alliteration I was going to talk about. But we'll take a look and just see what comes up. But let's look at what she has to say, whether or not this looks or sounds like poetry to us. And that'll be for you to decide. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe you don't think of it as poetry. But she says of poetry, because that's the title, she says, I too dislike it. Now that's a way to start a defense of something you're trying to defend. If you're a budding defense lawyer, it would be like getting up and saying, my client is guilty. So let's take a look and go on and see what she says. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. So again, making the case against poetry. It's fiddle. It's doesn't amount to much. Unimportant. Many more important things to do than worry about poetry. But then she goes on to sort of start making her case. She says, reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, which maybe that helps, having a contempt for it as you read it. Maybe that gives you something. One discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Now, genuine would be, in this case, I think something she's going to put value in. something that's genuine. I think it's something all of us can put value in. When I hear songs that sound genuine, if it's believable, I tend to appreciate them more, appreciate the artist more if they sound genuine. Anyway, she goes on to say, hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. So not because you can play tricks or use a bunch of fancy words or fancy poetic techniques, but they're useful. There are things in nature that are useful. A hand that can grasp, eyes that can dilate. Serves a purpose. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, and I think she's implying here what a lot of other poets may do to them to obscure what they are actually talking about. The same may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. So, again, if it's too complicated, beyond our comprehension of what the poet's trying to do, if the metaphors are too out there that we can't make the connections, then we don't appreciate it. You can go read, everyone from Shakespeare to, when he says something about love being like a rose, you get that. You may not get exactly everything he's saying, but, rose carries enough weight as a symbol of love that love can be like a rose. But if it gets too far out there, if he were to say, my love is like broccoli, you may miss it. Maybe there's something there if he's a vegetarian and broccoli is sustaining and full of nutrients, and maybe there's a metaphor there. But if you don't get it or don't understand it, you don't admire it. And there's probably no way to make a poem with love being about broccoli that we're going to admire. So feel free to try if you want, but I don't think it's going to happen. Let's see what she goes on to say. And I'll just read till I find a good period for stopping, being that she decides a stanza isn't good enough for a stopping point. The bat, holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twitching his skin like a horse that feels a flea, the baseball fan, the statistician, case after case could be cited, did one wish it. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. Okay. So she lists a lot of things that are important. A bat, elephants, horse. Now, the version of this poem that's in my book was different than one I could find online and cut and paste to put in here. I went back and tried to edit some parts. So if you have a version at home and there's some different words, some words it may be, or if you go to look it up online, it may have some different words that are in here, but they're very minor. And one of them is twitching. The one online said twinkling. However, my book says twitching. And twitching seems more like what a horse's skin would do when he has a flea than twinkling. So take that for what you will. Anyway, the baseball fan, the statistician, case after case could be made. So remember, she's talking about things that, all these phenomena are important. Everything she lists there. This is another list, kind of like we've seen before in other poems. a list of things that are important. And then she goes on to say, one must make a distinction, however, when dragged into prominence by half poets, the result is not poetry, nor till the poets among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it. So not until a real poet, not one of these half poets, can present us with imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have poetry. So this is, I think, the key, and I think maybe a lot of people may think that. Imaginary, what does that mean? Imaginary gardens with real toads in them. I like to think of it as there's, and we'll see when we talk about the Wallace Stevens poem, that's a defense of poetry. He makes a comment about how the stage used to be set for poetry and how nowadays the poem needs to create that again. There used to be form. There used to be things that were expected in poetry that you could rely on your audience coming to the poem with a certain knowledge. But I think what she's talking about here is, if you're going to present, not until you present me an imaginary garden with real toads in it, something that's real, and then remember, real and genuine. And I think of it as something that applies to me, to the reader. So I can read the Iliad. It's an imaginary garden. It's a garden full of war and bloodshed and betrayal. But there are things about the human condition in the Iliad. There are things that are applicable today, that are real today, that go on in the Iliad. There are things in Dante's Inferno. He's in hell. But we can see in Dante and his interaction with Virgil, who is his guide, and we'll talk about Dante later quite a lot. There's real toads in that garden, things that apply today. The suffering that Dante's going through is applicable today, is relatable today. And that's what I think, in her mind, only a full poet, not a half poet, can do, because she says, not until then, until we have these imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it. It being poetry. Because there's nothing else you can refer to, really. In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, I'm sorry, I'm reading again now. In the meantime, if you demand on the one hand, in defiance of their opinion, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, then you are interested in poetry. Now, I think this is kind of a loaded word, a key word. She doesn't say you'll like it. She doesn't say that's when you'll fall in love with poetry. She says, then you are interested in it. Again, I use the pronoun her. Marianne Moore is female. I'm not saying she's a speaker here. It's something I do. I think a lot of people do it. But it could be anyone. The speaker says, then you are interested in poetry. So I think that's apt, because that's kind of how I think I got into poetry. I became interested first. It was, there was an interest there, and what's all the hoopla about, and then you see some poems, and you see them, and you feel the realness about them and the genuineness. And once you can relate to something in the poem, in the real toads in the imaginary gardens, then you have it. According to the speaker here, you have real poetry, not half poetry. So does it make the best defense of poetry? I think it's a pretty good one. I don't know how many people could read it and be like, "Oh, yep, I'm starting my lifelong, love of reading poetry, just reading this poem." But I think it lays out a case pretty plain for poetry. Now, getting to the poem, is this poem poetry? It's laid out like a poem. Again, not a lot of rhyme, not a lot of it. There is some. There's some in these cases here. There's probably some, these lists. There's probably some. There's some imagery, maybe, of things, creating images in your mind. But she is known for not having sort of or maybe the least, or it's definitely the least typical. This is definitely the least typical poem, or what people, your random guy on the street would think of as poetry. If you presented him this and presented him Windhover, obviously Windhover would be, or even, a sonnet. They would say, and you said, which one's the most like, what you consider poetry? The sonnet's probably going to win every time. But I like it. I've always liked this poem. I like the argument that's made. I like the way her little twists of phrase makes you think about it in a different way. So that's about it for this poem. Let me know what you think. Does poetry need defending? Is it something worthwhile? Is it a waste of time? Something to do when you're idle? Smoking a pipe, maybe? Let me know. If you like the video, please go down and like the video. Click the little thumbs up button. Subscribe if you feel so inclined. And I'd like to thank you. This has been Pipes and Poetry. Have a good day.